Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell, and this is my spoiler review for Spider-Man Brand New Day. It's in theaters now, which means I can talk about all of the plot details and stuff I couldn't mention in my non-spoiler review. However, like I said, this will be full of spoilers, so if you haven't seen the movie, or you don't know what happens in the movie, or you don't want to know what happens in the movie, you can tune out now, maybe go watch my non-spoiler review and come back. If you have seen the movie, or you don't care about whether or not you know what happens in it, then you can keep on watching. I did go back and see the movie a second time so I could take some more detailed notes, revisit a couple things I wasn't so sure about. And generally, I would say that I liked it a little bit more the second time around, and I think it's for a couple different reasons. Number one, as I said in my initial review, I had to do that basically right after I saw the film. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to think about some things and try to put some things together. So it made more sense just in the days since I saw it the first time till the second time I saw it. And number two, when you see it a second time, when you kind of already know what the plot's going to be and you already know what's coming up, you can pay a little bit more attention to some of the character connections and how different things are tied together. And that was one of my major criticisms. Actually, I would say it was my biggest criticism in my non-spoiler review, is that I thought that the story felt a little herky-jerky. I didn't know if all the pieces worked together, even though I thought they all worked individually. And seeing it again, and we'll talk about a lot of it in this review, they actually did fit together a little bit more than I picked up on the first time around. So I still wouldn't say it's an incredible movie, as in, like one of the best ones of the year, but I will say that I liked it just a little bit more the second time I watched it. So let's talk about the major thing that I could not talk about at all in my non-spoiler review, and that is the villain of the film, if you want to call her a villain, which is Jean Grey, who's played by Sadie Sink. Now, this wasn't a huge surprise when you knew that they were casting a young, up-and-coming, redheaded actress in a Spider-Man movie. Well, we already have an MJ, so you know that's not who it is. You know mutants are coming into the MCU, so a lot of people said, well, she's probably playing Jean Grey, and they were right. I understand why you want to hold that back, because you do want there to be some surprises in the film, and I think that Disney was kind of in a no-win scenario with Jean Grey in this movie, because if you reveal it, then you've given away the big twist, but then everybody else can probably pretty much guess it. I do think that it probably is why we didn't hear anything about the X-Men at Comic-Con, because you can't bring everybody out and then either bring Sadie Sink out and spoil the surprise, or not bring her out and still pretty much spoil the surprise, which I think is where we're going to hear a lot more about the X-Men probably very soon. I mean, D23 is coming up. Now, the idea of including Jean Grey in the movie, I wasn't so sure about, because I was worried that it would take away from the Spider-Man of it all. So basically like, oh, you're introducing X-Men in the Spider-Man movie? Well, then now it's going to be a split focus between Spider-Man and trying to build up all this stuff coming up. But I was actually pleasantly surprised by how integrally they incorporated Jean Grey into the story that they were telling and into what Peter was going through. And you can see a lot of each other in those characters. And so it didn't feel like just a shallow cameo or somebody who was kind of rammed into a movie in the sake of building up to future movies. It did feel like a Spider-Man story featuring a counterpart in many ways of what he was going through, and it made sense, and I appreciate that. I mean, both of these characters are dealing with loss. They're both feeling alone in the world. And Peter ends up being for Jean, in many ways, what Tony Stark was for him, a mentor, a guide. And I think that it was also a great way to bring Aunt May back into the storyline. We'll talk about Marissa Tomei and Aunt May a little bit more later on. But to honor her legacy and to basically say, these words echoed beyond her death, and they're still useful to Peter and helpful to him in ways that he can then pass them on to the next generation. And that's what I think really made the story work. If you would have just had Jean Grey as a villain, and then, you kind of throw her in at the end, but she doesn't really have much to do with the Peter Parker storyline, then I think it would have felt like, oh, well, I wish we could have just had a Spider-Man movie. But they tied everything together at the end very well. And I like that they didn't include a whole bunch of other X-Men or really hint at what was coming up with the mutant storyline. It was very much about Jean and about Peter. Now, at the same time, I do think that there were potential avenues that the story could take following this movie to go into the X-Men storyline. For example, Peter's inhibitor chip. Again, in context of this story, it made sense to include it because he's trying to control his powers. It became something that he tried to use and eventually successfully used to control Jean's powers. But when you broaden that out, the idea of an inhibitor chip, I mean, I'm an X-Men animated series fan, the mutant collars that took away their powers, this is something that you see in the comics, the idea of taking away a mutant's powers in order to control them. And, Jean destroyed her chip. I'm pretty sure Peter left his behind. after he was fighting with the hand at Damage Control. So it's very possible that that technology is now in the hands of either Damage Control or Tremel Tillman's character and could be used in future movies. It sets up the concept of mutants, of being rejected. Jean and her sister were cast out by her parents. It sets up the concept of a government agency who's scared by mutants and is looking to take that power and harness it for their own purposes. So there are some bigger things that are set up in this movie that don't feel like they're there just for the sake of setup, but you can spin out of the story that's been told in Spider-Man Brand New Day and use those elements in later movies. And I think generally, if you're going to have an interconnected universe, that's how you should do it. There have been a lot of Marvel movies and projects that have gotten it wrong, where it didn't feel natural, where it did feel forced, and I'm glad that this wasn't one of those cases. And talking about Jean's powers and what we see, I like the fact that we see her at sort of a stage 1, and then she becomes, on the road at least, to the Omega level mutant that we know. She gets much, much stronger. But I like how Destin Daniel Cretton visualized her being able to jump into different bodies. I think another movie would have gone for a visually flashier way of like taking a camera and zooming it in, and you're like, you know, this big digital thing of coming out from the eyes and going through in the air and jumping into somebody else's body. And it might have looked kind of cool, but it also would have just been digital noise, or at least had the potential. But what I loved is that you don't get that. And instead, it looked like to me, it was all done practically in camera and just done with actors where you're working with them on body movement and the synchronization of kind of pitching forward with Jean jumping out of one body and pitching back of Jean jumping into another body. And it was so effective along with the sound design. It was a way to not overuse digital effects. And it could have looked really silly if you weren't working with people who were coordinating that movement very well. But I think that the choreographers, Destin Daniel Cretton, and the actors all worked very well to make that effect believable and also something that just looked good in camera. So everything happening with Jean, obviously the biggest spoiler in the movie, the other one being Peter and MJ. And I want to talk about their relationship and where this movie went with them. I was really worried after No Way Home that they were just going to solve that cliffhanger very easily, that it was going to kind of be like what we saw in that rooftop scene. And when we went to the roof scene and Peter and MJ kissed and she's like, "Oh, I remember who you are," I kind of rolled my eyes and I was like, oh, great, here we go. This is exactly what I was worried about was going to happen. And then it didn't go that way. It was a trick that Jean was playing on Peter, and a particularly cruel trick as well. I mean, to talk about taking a guy's hopes and just crushing them even further. And I think that Zendaya played that scene very well as somebody who was, you know, Jean pretending to be MJ, but then revealing herself. You have to kind of walk a kind of a tightrope to play that scene correctly. And I think that it was really well played, and it avoided the easy resolution to their relationship. And instead we got something that felt much more realistic to me, which was that scene in Frank's boat towards the end of the film where they have that discussion and MJ says, "Listen, I'm sure that the girl you wrote this letter to, I'm sure you had a lot of great memories, but I'm not that girl. I'm not in love with you." And it didn't come off as angry. It didn't come off as hurtful. It was just a really genuine conversation. And I think that it does take some guts on the part of the writers and the actors and Destin Daniel Cretton to go that route, because you know that they know that fans would have been so happy and it would have been an applause break if MJ had said like, "Oh my God, Peter, I remember," or if they had gotten back together by the end of this movie. But they didn't go with that easy solution. They laid the groundwork for that. But to me, to make it just about getting Peter and MJ back together would have been too simple. And instead, this was about Peter finding his way in this new world, in this new reality. And to just be best friends with Ned again, and to just be with Zendaya or MJ again, that to me would have felt like he didn't progress. He would have regressed as a character when so much of the story is about him accepting that reality, embracing being both Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and understanding that he can't just throw himself into a world where he shuts all of this stuff out. So the easy route probably would have been the more crowd-pleasing route. They went the harder route, and I think that they pulled it off very well. And I'm glad that that sort of false start that we got on the rooftop ended up being just that. And also, by the way, played into the story of the film, enhanced Jean as a villain, and gave Tom Holland a really good beat to play as well. I also think there's some ambiguity in that final scene between Peter and Ned where they meet up and, Ned instinctively knows the handshake. I think you can read that Peter that he says at the end a couple different ways. Some folks, I believe, will probably interpret it as Ned's memory has come back and he remembers who Peter is because the handshake, in a weird way kind of unlocks something in his brain. But to me, again, I think that would be kind of a regression in what we've established in this movie. We know that Ned knows that Spider-Man's name is Peter. I think that there is part of him that remembers that handshake. But to me, when he says Peter at the end, it's not him remembering the Peter Parker that he knew. It's him making that connection. Spider-Man's name is Peter. This guy who I've seen before, he just said his name is Peter. And so he's now discovered who Spider-Man is. And it's the start of a new friendship for them. So it's not going back to what they had. It's the start of something new, which I think, again, is sort of the theme of the whole movie. At least that's just my take on it. Regardless, though, I really like that scene where Spider-Man and Ned are sitting and building Lego and quoting Lord of the Rings back and forth to each other, and MJ's sitting there on the couch drawing them. And again, I think that kind of bolsters the idea that they don't have to go back to getting all their memories back in order to become friends again. It's more about rediscovering that connection that they have with each other. And again, the whole movie really is about Peter rediscovering the connections that he has with people. Peter's story in this film, I thought, was pretty good. I've seen some comparisons to Spider-Man 2 with his powers kind of going on the fritz, but that to me in the Tobey Maguire movie was more of like a psychological blocking of his powers. This was an evolution, a maturation. It was a new phase for Peter, but it was chaotic because he was putting his own mind and his own body under so much stress by trying to take everything on alone and not depending on anybody else. And I'm glad that it wasn't a temporary thing, that it wasn't like, oh, I didn't have control, but now that things are better in my life, I do have control. Again, this was about a restart for the character and his relationships with everybody else. And it wasn't until he understood and internalized what Aunt May had told him and what he had learned through the rest of the film, the idea that he has to embrace both being Spider-Man and even the pain and the hardship and the difficulty of being Peter Parker. That's where we get this sort of new version of Spider-Man. So things aren't going to go back to the way that they were. He's just learned to harness what the new reality is. And I really liked that new reality. I liked the new power set that we saw for Spider-Man. I mean, it's scary when he doesn't have control over those powers, but with the new webs and with the enhanced strength and everything else, I think it just allows even more possibilities for what Spider-Man can do in the future and who he can take on and what we see of him beyond just the mechanical web shooters and everything else. That's great, but this is our fourth Spider-Man movie just with Tom Holland. I like that we're getting a new flavor without fundamentally changing who the character is. And I know that a lot of people are kind of down on Tom Holland. They don't think he's a very good actor, but I've never really shared that sentiment. I've actually always thought he was a really good Spider-Man, and I appreciated his performance a bit more on my rewatch of the film. He doesn't have those big moments, the kind that he had in No Way Home, which I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, but he does such a good job of giving Peter such a world weariness from the very beginning. You can feel his exhaustion. You can feel his heartbreak. And then toward the end of the film, the way that he's able to show such empathy and sympathy for Jean in the scene where, they're talking, again, that could be a very kind of corny scene if it's played melodramatically. Sadie Sink didn't play it that way, and Tom Holland didn't play it that way. And it really did feel like finding a genuine connection, his first genuine connection with anybody, really, in years, and two characters coming to understand each other. There was just such a warmth to that final act of the film from him. And then I loved how Tom Holland played that moment when he was leaving the hospital and Frank was pretending to be Spider-Man, and he was able to just stand among the crowd and hear how much they love Spider-Man. I mean, you could almost kind of sense that it was filling his heart up, and the little kid, giving the Spider-Man motion and everything else. Tom Holland has been very vocal about the fact that he wasn't sure if he wanted to do another Spider-Man, and that he was also kind of in on the process of creating this film and had some say in the direction of the character. I mean, he's been playing it for 10 years now, through his young adulthood and now into his adulthood. I think he's 30 at this point. And I like the fact that he has the clout and he has the ability to say, I want, a say in this creative direction. And he does it in a way that shows that, at least to me, I think he has a genuine love for the character, and not just a genuine love for the character, but a genuine desire to tell good Spider-Man stories. A lot of time when an actor gets involved on the creative level, it can really go downhill. I think Fast and the Furious is an example of that. But I do feel, or at least it seems like, a very genuine sense from Tom Holland that he loves Spider-Man and he wants people to go to Spider-Man movies and have a great time. And I think that comes through in this movie. Now, is he going to do another one? Is he not going to do another one? I don't really know. If I had to bet, I'd say he might do one more and maybe officially hand the baton off to whoever the next Spider-Man is going to be. But I liked him in this movie, and I like him in this role. And like I said in my non-spoiler review, I like that the movies have matured along with Peter so that he doesn't seem like a young teenager in a 30-year-old body at this point. He has adult problems, and he's kind of mourning for really his lost childhood, but it works. I mean, you really can trace the arc of this character over his 4 solo films and his other appearances in the MCU, and I do think that Tom Holland is a big part of that. I said in my other review that John Bernthal is not who I would have guessed would be the biggest laugh generator in the film, but the dynamic between Spider-Man and Punisher was really well done. And they also didn't ditch all of the darker sensibilities for the Punisher. I know that he is, pretty jokey in the film, but they gave him some moments where you really see that core that he's kind of hiding from Spider-Man to some degree. I love that conversation between the two of them where, he says, do you think me living like this alone is a lifestyle choice? You think I want to live like this? If I had a minute that I could spend with my loved ones, I would do everything that I could to possibly do that. And it really does draw that dividing line between Frank and Peter in this movie and why Peter should not be going down this road. And it's true to the core of that character. I do feel like John Bernthal, and he said this, wants to keep the core of the Punisher intact, even though if this is perhaps a lighter version of him than he's done in other Marvel shows. But most importantly, it worked for this movie. And I like how MJ and Frank actually kind of got along from the very start because MJ has darker sensibilities. Frank could sense that. She could kind of give as good as she got and vice versa. And again, it goes to what I was saying about writing these other Marvel characters into this movie. It could have felt cheap. The Punisher could have just shown up for a scene or two and growled a little bit and then left. But it does feel like in writing Hulk and Punisher and Jean Grey and everybody else, there was real care to say, we don't just want to include these characters for the sake of including them. We want them to feel like they are integral to the story that is being told. And that's what was done for every single character that was put in as a cameo or a supporting character, except for maybe, I might say, Elena. Now listen, I love Florence Pugh, but that was the only cameo in the film that felt a little bit unnecessary. It brought some laughs, but I did feel like that was the only one that felt somewhat wedged in. Also, I don't know if anybody else thought this, and it wasn't as noticeable the second time I watched it as the first, but the scene where they're in the pool and Peter's got to, strip down to his underwear, but he's got the Spider-Man mask on. To me, it looked like the Spider-Man mask, like his head was digital. Now there's no reason that it should have been, and I can't imagine there's any reason why they would have done that. Maybe it was just sort of the uncanniness of, you have the Spider-Man neck and it's bright red meeting a regular person's neck, so it's just the contrast is so much that it just looks like it's pasted on somebody's body. But it was distracting to me the first time, especially that I watched it, because I'm like, did they do a digital head replacement on Spider-Man? I don't think that they did, but it was something that had me kind of going like, what's going on here? It was nice seeing Mark Ruffalo back in the movie, as well as Angry Hulk back in the movie. And again, Jean using Hulk to help her break into the vault made sense on a story level. But before that even, I thought that Mark Ruffalo gave such a warm performance as Banner when Peter came to see me at the university. Like, he was so happy to actually talk about science after having all these classes of kids who just wanted to ask Avengers questions. And then the Hulk Spider-Man fight, I love that. I mean, when Punisher jumped in, that just felt like one of those straight out of a comic book moments that I love seeing, especially when it actually makes sense for the movie itself. And I love that Jean didn't influence Banner to turn into the, angry, less in control Hulk that we haven't seen in a while. It was because she was messing around in his head, and it broke down these barriers that Bruce had spent so long building up. And it made her less villainous, because if Jean had said, now you're going to turn into this rampaging monster, I think it would have made her a little bit less sympathetic as a character, because she somewhat kept control over what she was doing. Not to say that it wasn't reckless, but she somewhat kept control over her actions. And by not making Bruce turn into the Hulk, it was an unintended consequence and not something that she deliberately did that could have caused a lot of death and destruction. Also, and this is maybe something that's also up for interpretation, at the end of that Spider-Man Hulk fight, right before he fell off of the building, it looked to me like the Hulk might have kind of recognized the name Peter and had a connection to him beyond just this fight. When he said, "It's Peter, I'm your friend," when he was talking him down, it's sort of ambiguous. It could have just been that he got through to the banner that was inside of his head to get him to calm down and fall off the building. But it almost looked like kind of a curious look. And this is a big, green Hulk monster, so it's hard to read facial expressions. But it would be kind of an interesting twist if, this version of the Hulk was buried deep inside Bruce Banner's consciousness when Doctor Strange did the spell to make everybody forget. It would be kind of interesting if this Hulk does, on some level, remember who Peter Parker is and remembers him pre, what happened in No Way Home, and can make that connection and maybe help Banner make that connection. And that could be, again, a natural, progressive road back to some people remembering him instead of everybody remembering all at once. But that was another thing where, I think that's for me is a fun moment in the movie where you kind of go, oh, okay, so does he remember who he is or does he not? We'll have to see. Moving on to some more random thoughts, I was really happy with Destin Daniel Cretton's work as director here, starting with that opening sequence that recreated so many classic Spider-Man comic book covers. That was just a really fun visual way to kick off the film. And I thought that the Marvel title card with all of the Spider-Man images was pretty cool, although it did throw me at first because I associate that, devoting a title card specifically to one character, to what they did to honor Chadwick Boseman at the beginning of Black Panther Wakanda Forever. So to see all of the Spider-Man stuff, to me at first I was just like, oh, it kind of makes it feel like Spider-Man died. But I also feel like maybe they're going to start doing that a little bit more and customizing that a little bit more. And it was cool to see those flashes of images from previous movies. But at first I was like, oh, okay, that's a little somber. Overall, though, I think that Destin Daniel Cretton really grounded this movie a little bit more, which fit with the story that they were telling, and made a lot of really cool choices with things like the fight choreography, especially Peter's final showdown with the hand. I even liked his choice on the end credits, which were done just over these really nice shots of New York instead of those hyper-stylized superhero visuals that we usually get with a comic book movie. It made the film feel like it was focused on the characters, and it ended on a very human note instead of like a pow, Spider-Man, director. It just felt very grounded. Again, I use that word a lot because that's what it feels like he brought to the movie. As far as I'm concerned, and I haven't had a chance to see Wonder Man yet, but I think cinematically, Destin Daniel Cretton is 2 for 2 as far as MCU films, because I also enjoyed Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. And if he wants the work, I really hope that they keep bringing him into the MCU on other projects, because I like what he brings to this universe. Tremel Tillman played a great sociopath in the movie, and a lot of times when you think about sociopaths, you think, like serial killers, but he was the kind of sociopath who has no qualms, no regrets, no hesitation whatsoever to smile right in your face, tell you a bold-faced lie, and then plan against you behind your back. And those are really kind of the scary sociopaths, the one that come at you with a smile that you don't see coming. And, he's missing at the end of this movie. We don't know where he is. Maybe he's got the inhibitor chip or some other tech. And I wonder if they're setting him up. I don't know if he could stay at damage control because things didn't go so well there. But I wonder if they're setting him up to play sort of a Bolivar Trask-like role as you bring the X-Men in, where he's working off the books on anti-mutant tech with the start that he got with the inhibitor chip in this movie. And if they intend to bring him back as kind of an antagonist to the X-Men and the persecution that they inevitably are going to face. I mentioned Marissa Tomei coming back, and I'm glad that Jean's powers allowed the movie to bring Aunt May back in a natural way. And it's really a touching idea to think about somebody who was so insightful and who was full of such positivity and love that their influence continues, that the advice that she gave Peter kind of at the beginning of his life as Spider-Man is useful all of these years later, even after she's no longer with us. And I think it's realistic. You know, when I think about people that are important in my life that have passed on, that had a huge amount of influence, I don't just think about, you know, the most memorable thing they said to me one time or the most important thing they said to me. I think of conversations that we had over the years. And it's a way to sort of strengthen and deepen even more Peter's relationship with Aunt May, even though she's dead, in a way that goes beyond just flashing back once again to her saying, you know, great power, great responsibility. It's a great line, but I like that you see in a very realistic way the way that the people who we love and the people who love us can not only affect our lives in a way that changes who we are, but that allows us to pass that worldview and help people in need. And that's what Aunt May was all about. She helped people in need, and she was continuing to do that even after she died in the last movie. Okay, this is a weird kind of side road thought, but it's something that popped in my head when I was watching the film. So we see characters watching movies on TV or on streaming twice in the film that I can think of. Number one, Men in Black was on when Peter went to go see Elena. It's a Sony movie, so they can get it rights free. No surprise there. And then number two, we see that Ned has Empire Strikes Back on while he's sitting at his computer, I think right before Peter shows up and they get to meet each other for the first time. And I've always wondered, and maybe I brought this up, but I think actually we talked about this or made a joke about it in Honest Trailers at one point. But when you have a movie inside of a cinematic universe with actors who play characters in that cinematic universe, in those movies, do the actors look the same or do they look different? So like if you're watching Men in Black, let's say somebody in New York is watching Men in Black, like do they see Edgar and they're like, hey, that guy looks just like Kingpin. Have you ever noticed how much Edgar looks like Wilson Fisk? Or when, you know, if there's like a World War II vet, or if Captain America was doing his pop culture catch up after he got unthawed before the Avengers and he watched Men in Black, does he look at Tommy Lee Jones's character and be like, that looks just like the guy from Basic Training? Or if Ned is watching Empire Strikes Back, does he look at Han Solo and he's like, that's the president? That's the guy who was the president. What's going on there? It's a stupid thing to think about, but it's something I've always thought was interesting. And maybe it's been addressed in a movie. I'm not really sure if it has. Last Action Hero kind of addressed it, because they had a character played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, and it was one of my favorite jokes in the movie that every Arnold Schwarzenegger role in the world of Jack Slater in Last Action Hero was played by Sylvester Stallone. So I wonder if there is like a Sylvester Stallone thing where a different actor plays those roles, because those actors are people in the MCU. These are the weird things I think about. And finally, I guess we should talk about that little end credits sting. I would say it's one of the most lightweight end credits things that we've had in an MCU film. And it basically just sets up something about Spider-Man, or a version of Spider-Man coming from space. We see the Spidey tracker and it goes out into space and we see something coming in. I'm not exactly sure what that's setting up or who that might be setting up. Maybe Marvel doesn't even really know who that's setting up. It could play into Doomsday or Secret Wars or something. Who knows? Like I said, it's obvious that Tom Holland, it's not obvious, he said that he wants to hand the baton over to the next generation. So maybe this is starting that process, whatever it's going to be. But to me, this was more of a teaser than anything that's meant to be crucial or important in the sense of just like, oh, you have to have seen that thing to understand this. I think it's more of a case of like, all right, we're already going to start laying the little breadcrumbs to what's next, and here's just a little glimpse of what we might have in store. After all, in-credit stuff in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they use it or don't use it at their own discretion. So those are some of my spoiler thoughts on Spider-Man Brand New Day. What do you think? Did you like the movie? It seems to be getting a really positive audience response so far. It looks like it might even be gunning for the opening weekend record of Avengers Endgame. Be sure to stay tuned right here on the channel because, of course, on Charts with Dan on Tuesday, I will be covering extensively all the records that might have been set or perhaps not set by Spider-Man Brand New Day. And hey, if you want to check out another video I did earlier in the week, I did something about the Odyssey, taking on a lot of the theories or conspiracy theories, whatever you want to call, about the movie and its performance. I'm really proud of the video, and I'd love it if you want to check that out. And of course, stay tuned right here for the latest in movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.